All right, so my name is Aurora, and I'll be moderating our first panel, Provocations on History, Fairness, and Justice. And so I am a PhD student at IDSS, and I just want to introduce our panelists. So a major theme of our discussions today is exploring the use of algorithmic technologies in the housing space. But first, for this panel, we want to take a 10,000-foot view of the situation to have a more abstract discussion about history, policy, and algorithmic decision-making processes. I should probably take my mask off. We can see that a lot of the structural aspects of housing discrimination is deeply baked into the US housing system. So it's important to learn about how these mechanisms work before embarking on a project to debias algorithms. So one of the main ideas of this panel and of today is the importance of cross-disciplinary learning and conversation. We wanted to bring together experts from different fields to have a conversation about the assumptions and histories underlying decision-making systems in the housing space and how understanding this can help data scientists develop algorithms that move beyond simple notions of fairness towards advancing justice. So first, I'm going to let the panelists introduce themselves and some of the work they've been doing, and then we'll jump into the questions. So I think first we'll have Todd.
Thank you, Aurora. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for this welcome opportunity to bridge the disciplines of data science, policy studies, social science, and history. As a historian, I'm eager to share and have my perspectives broadened by your rich and incredibly important work. So I want to explore a distinction between heuristic and algorithmic thinking in the formation of racialized procedures and policies at New Deal agencies like the Homeowners Loan Corporation and the Federal Housing Administration, and in the process, share some new research findings that adjust our understanding of how these racist tools and practices were disseminated with an eye on how they contributed to the unfair outcomes with which we are also familiar. I'm excited to hear your thoughts and your feedback on my distinctions between heuristic and algorithmic thinking. This distinction is certainly new to me, and I may not be appreciating all the nuances. So I understand an algorithm to be a set of specified procedures that produce a definite result, whereas a heuristic is more of a shortcut evaluatory method that uses approaches like deduction, trial and error, or holism to arrive at an answer. But let me start by emphasizing that these federal agencies' policies and practices were explicitly racist, and then they were premised on the assumption that the presence of African Americans and other racial minorities invariably depreciated property values in white neighborhoods. So it's not a question of which of these approaches was worse, heuristic or algorithmic. And you may know these racist assumptions derive from longstanding white American views of black people and were given heft by the scientific racism and the eugenics movement leading into the 20th century. More immediately, these stem from white fears amid the Great Migration of African Americans to northern cities that began during World War I, but which was continuing even during the Great Depression when these maps were made. So my new research, 3 articles, 2 of which I wrote with LaDale Windling, a co-founder of Mapping Inequality, significantly complicate explanations of how these racist federal policies were formulated and disseminated. So some of the key findings we elaborate on, which you may or may not be familiar with because other scholars have explored some of these. The Homeowners Loan Corporation, or HOLC, issued virtually all of its mortgage refinancing loans from 1933 to 1936 before it made its security maps from 1936 to 1940. Therefore, it could not have used the maps to deny those refinancing loans. Also, HOLC lent to African American homeowners, 25,000 of them approximately, in fact. And finally, academic, professional, and governmental networks spread redlining theories and practice through public-private collaborations and also through a rich ecosystem of real estate industry publications. So in other words, it was not necessary for HOLC to disseminate the actual maps directly to private industry. And all the evidence so far is that they did not actually do that. Rather, what they did was they taught private industry how to make their own redlining maps. So that may be a little bit of a different interpretation than you're used to. My solo article on how HOLC made and used its maps returns us to the distinction between heuristic and algorithmic thinking. In internal Hulk correspondence I painstakingly found on 485 reels of uncatalogued microfilm at the National Archives, I discovered the process Hulk used to make these maps was highly improvised, and it was also extremely arbitrary. And often it relied on the opinions of local realtors and lenders instead of some top-down methodology. So in other words, this was a heuristic process. On the other hand, we don't know exactly how FHA made its own maps for determining eligibility for its loan insurance, and those were shredded by the Nixon administration in 1969. It's recently been discovered. But there are indications that they may have used block-level census statistics to define the area boundaries on those maps. So that would be more of an algorithmic approach. On its appraisal forms, too, Hulk's approach was heuristic, and it didn't reach any definite conclusion about whether to approve or deny loans. It really only provided a summation of information, including the racially informed neighborhood trend that they were supposed to indicate which way a neighborhood was going. And this allowed its underwriters considerable leeway in making their decisions. FHA's neighborhood rating protocol, in contrast, arrived at a definite percentage score, as you may be able to see from the lower right illustration I have up there. And that percentage score determined whether or not it would insure mortgages in the area. Once Hulk had its redlining maps, however, it could have used these more algorithmically. And one way that we've theorized this may have happened is that if there was a savings and loan that was seeking to join the Federal Home Loan Bank Board, which oversaw Hulk, it might have had to submit a map of where it made its own loans, which could then be compared with the security maps to decide whether that was going to be eligible. And if it was determined there were too many quote-unquote risky loans located in the lowly rated areas, maybe that membership would be denied. So I say could have because we really don't yet have a good granular sense of Hulk's operations after 1936. But I, for one, am committed to finding this out as soon as I can get back into the National Archives to continue my research. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Next, we'll have, just going down the list, Timney, please.
Hi, everybody. So I think the question is to elaborate on how, can you repeat the question?
Oh, just give a very brief introduction of your work in like 3 or 4 minutes.
Oh,
Yeah.
I was reading some of your questions and about the history. And so how do I summarize my work? Well, I generally say that really my work is, I did a PhD in the AI lab, and so I generally think about how to do research in this space in artificial intelligence. But the question is how to do this research in a way that is not so exploitative and harmful, because I think the underlying current of how we do this research is extremely exploitative, extremely harmful in many ways. So for instance, Karen Howe from MIT Tech Review just had this series on AI colonialism, right? Where she went to different continents, starting in South Africa, then in Colombia, then in New Zealand, then in Indonesia. And she was basically talking about how this colonial order, modern day colonial order, is being perpetuated by this field and by the companies. And in my view, actually, the elite institutions like MIT and Stanford are very much part of the problem. So what I am trying to do in my work is to figure out how to do this research in a way that's not doing that, and is trying to undo some of that harm in some ways. So if we're building technology that is based on AI systems, how do we do it in a way that is beneficial to our community? So actually one of Karen's articles was on this group of people in New Zealand who are using language technology for language revitalization. So the Maori were doing this, and they actually were it was this really beautiful thing where they collected data using a local radio station, and they had a competition because they were trying to create language tech, like speech to text technology, for instance. Once they gathered this data, an American company, Lionbridge, wanted to license this data from them, and they rejected the offer, and they published this video discussing why they didn't want to do this, right? Because they said, well, they beat the language out of our grandparents, and now they want to sell our language back to us as a service. And so why would this company want to buy our data? It's obviously not because their first and foremost concern is how to benefit the Maori people. So in that sense, I see kind of a community that is using this technology for things that are truly beneficial to them, right? But that's a very, very unusual thing right now, in my view. When I'm looking at quote unquote AI, it is being used to entrench the status quo at such a huge scale. So the question is, how do we raise alarm about the harms when we see them? And how do we, and when there are times when we can use this technology in a way that's beneficial to people, how do we do that? So that's sort of an introduction to my work. A lot of times people say I do AI ethics, but really I'm not. I'm not an ethicist, or I'm not. I'm a researcher in this field in AI, who happens to, unfortunately, have see an intersection of the harms that are done to many people, many members of communities that I'm from, and tries to uncover them. So in that sense, I get stuck, trying to show these harms and undo these harms and fight back. But so that is kind of currently, this is my my underlying work, the work that I'm hoping to achieve.
Okay, thank you so much. Next we have Ben.
Cool. Hi, everyone. I'm Ben Green. I'm a postdoc at the University of Michigan in the School of Public Policy. I'm really excited to be here, part of this great conversation in this panel, and with the rest of the speakers and discussions for the rest of the day. So my work looks at the use of algorithms in government agencies. So I think a lot about how algorithms, and particularly machine learning systems, get used to inform and affect decision-making processes, particularly decision-making about individuals in particular cases. So a lot of that, and what I really try to think about, is how the methodology of developing machine learning systems typically fails to account for social contexts and history and policy in ways that lead to a significant gap between often the expectations of engineers that algorithmic systems will be fair or will benefit society, and the real world harms that will result from the actual implementation of these tools in practice. So very much aligned, I think, with much of what Timnit is also doing in her great work. So for the sake of this panel, I think there are two questions that I want to put onto the table as starting points in relation to my work. And I just have notes on my phone. I promise I'm not on Twitter. The first question is, what does it mean to say that data is biased, right? It's very common to say, okay, well, algorithms are biased because data is biased. And then the question that we want to think about is, what does that actually mean? What do we mean by the nature of this data bias? And I think it's incredibly important to distinguish between two different phenomena when we're talking about this. So the first is the idea that data is biased because of biased human behaviors, right? We're just picking up data. The data reflects the bias of human decision makers. So in the context of lending, we might say that the data reflects fewer loans given to black applicants because the human loan agents were biased and overestimated the riskiness of black applicants, right? And this is what I see as the typical notion of how we mean that data is biased. But there's a second notion that I think is quite distinct from this, which is that the data reflects entrenched inequality. So in the case of lending, again, we might say that Black loan applicants have less wealth because of historical and current forms of oppression, which means that they are higher risk at default. They have lower credit than white applicants. And this is a result of historic discrimination that has led to a significant wealth gap between Black and white communities in the United States. And so these two different phenomena are quite different, and often we're in case two, where what we're really dealing with are entrenched inequalities, but that are empirically there, as opposed to data that misrepresents the underlying situation. In case one, the goal, and because we often think we're in case one, the goal of algorithmic fairness research is typically to strive for accuracy, right? That if we could just understand the true levels of creditworthiness of different applicants, we could get rid of discrimination and bias. But if we're in case two, where that where the gap in wealth and credit risk is genuinely there because of entrenched inequality, then accuracy alone does not solve the picture, right? We don't simply want to make accurate predictions about the creditworthiness of different applicants when the credit risk of different applicants are deeply baked in with histories of racist policies. So we want to be very careful about what we mean by the data is biased or the data reflects inequality and how we respond to that in terms of developing systems. And then the second question is, how can we pursue algorithmic justice? What does it mean to take a more justice-oriented approach to the use and development of algorithms? And what I think is essential here is that we need to talk about more than just the algorithm alone. The goal should not be to simply view justice as a feature of the algorithm, saying, well, if only we could tune the algorithm instead of being tuned for accuracy, we tune it for only providing loans to Black applicants, or only ensuring that the error rates across different groups are balanced. I think if we try to focus on just the algorithm or the decision-making process as the site of justice, we're going to end up with an incredibly limited strategy that, in fact, often will be quite blocked by legal roadblocks and legal statutes. And so when I think about I think a lot about how can computer scientists and algorithm developers take a more justice-oriented approach to the use of algorithms. And to me, rather than focusing on the algorithm, that means finding ways to incorporate algorithms into broader agendas for policy reform. So I, in my writing, am thinking about how do we shift from a model of formal algorithmic fairness that focuses on fairness as a property of algorithms, often oriented around the logic of formal equality, to substantive algorithmic fairness, where we're thinking about the larger political context and we're drawing on substantive equality notions, but not simply saying we're going to develop substantively equal algorithms, but rather trying to incorporate algorithms into broader reform agendas that are oriented around substantive equality. So for me, this means that rather than asking how can we create just algorithms, we follow a series of questions to orient the development of algorithms towards being part of broader agendas for social change, starting with a deeper diagnosis of what the substantive inequalities are in a given decision-making context, then looking at what are the types of reforms that can actually address those substantive inequalities, not starting with the idea of algorithms, but really thinking about what are the social and political factors that need to change to address these inequities, and only there looking at what roles, if any, can algorithms play to enhance or facilitate the desired reforms. So as we think about algorithmic justice, the goal should not simply be, how can we use algorithms as tools for justice, but taking a more agnostic approach to the use of algorithms and thinking about what roles they can and can't play in broader community-led and democratic efforts for more equitable policy in housing and many other domains. So thanks, and looking forward to the rest of the conversation.
Thank you. And next we have Nancy.
Hi, everyone. I'm delighted to be joining you in this conversation. Thank you, Aurora, for leading this conversation. I also want to say briefly how happy I am about the hybrid format. Thank you for making this conference inclusive for those of us who can't always travel. So I really appreciate that. My name is Nancy Kwok. My pronouns are she, her. I'm an urban historian. And I work in particular on the history of home ownership and affordable housing policy, both in the US and then also embedded in technical assistance programs via intergovernmental organizations and bilateral aid programs. And I know this program is about the US, but I would just really briefly observe that a lot of our housing difficulties with racialized and class inequalities and perpetuated by policy, this sort of limited access to equity, restrictions on upward mobility through housing policy, involuntary relocation, all of the problems that I think we're talking about in the United States have parallels and connections to housing problems that are occurring across the world. So I just wanted to quickly put out there that this does seem very much part of a global story. More recently, I have two areas of work that I think are relevant to the discussion that we're going to be having today in this conference. And so the first one is that I've been looking at the longer arc of urban informality across the 20th century, and looking especially at sheltering strategies that are happening outside of state control or knowledge. And in particular, I look at how urban dwellers create their own housing when market housing is unaffordable or unavailable, and what impact this sort of dual housing system has on urban governance and on the well-being of people who are dwelling in this informal housing. And so here I've learned actually a lot from Timnit's comments on how to do research without contributing to the harms that are happening and occurring in communities. The second area of research that I'm interested in is in the multi-generational effects of involuntary physical relocation. And I look at this question through a multiracial lens, and I argue that we can understand inequality better when we're using a multiracial approach. So I begin with urban renewal and clearance programs using eminent domain, programs that triggered highly unequal compensation programs for white versus non-white families, moved through federal and local policy making, and that resulted in as yet uncalculated and multi-generational wealth loss, especially for Black and African Americans, but also for other groups as well, especially in the cases that I'm looking at for Latinx families. I also look at this question of involuntary relocation through the lens of internment and the long-term effects for Asian American and specifically Japanese American communities. I also am interested in termination and urbanization for Native peoples beginning in the 1950s and reaching all the way to today, as well as road and infrastructure building programs, especially after the federal interstate system was put into place in the 1950s, and the effects on multiple communities across the spectrum of American racial politics. And then most recently, gentrification. So as you can probably tell from my comments, I'm really nowhere near being a data scientist, nor do I work with data and mapping in the way that you do. So I'm really here to learn from you. And I'm particularly curious, adopting a little bit of Ben's system here, I'd particularly be interested in hearing about how algorithms deal with missing information. And then also how algorithms account for multi-generational effects, both leading up to and predicting the future. So I'll stop talking there. I know we were supposed to just talk for a couple of minutes.
All right, thank you so much. Oh, great. So I think I'm going to begin with a question, and it's going to have a bit of setup. So I think you've talked a little bit about this, Ben, but just thinking about a very specific example and how that can inform our thinking about just and fair algorithms and the history surrounding it. So just to give a bit of background, so the Fair Housing Act of 1968 forbade property owners and mortgage lenders from discriminating against prospective buyers on the basis of race. However, it has also been found that credit algorithms will also often use zip code as a proxy for race, where riskier zip codes are correlated with higher percentages of Black people. So I want to use this example to think about the differences between accuracy, fairness, and justice, and also historically how thinking about evaluating and appraising property came about. So I guess my first question is, about how should one think about the trade-off between accuracy and justice, which I think you briefly discussed. But So one goal we have for an algorithm, one goal we might have for an algorithm is to accurately predict who is likely to default on their loans. A fair algorithm would treat like things alike, so assigning the same risk score to a black and white individual who are both equally likely to default. But if black Americans are more likely to default because of historically racist policies that have created a wealth gap, how should we address this discrepancy in a predictive algorithm? I guess, yeah, welcome any thoughts about that?
I mean, I can start, I guess, since I sort of touched on this a bit. Yeah, I mean, I think as your question indicates, the typical responses that we'd want to have around just saying the goal is accuracy or fairness, right? Treating like cases alike doesn't really get at addressing the historical inequities that exist, right? In terms of eligibility or creditworthiness or default risk. So, the question, right, is what would a more just approach look like? And perhaps, and here, is where I would love the folks who study housing and urban planning more to jump in on what that would look like. But I think that the answer is not simply to say that we can tune the algorithm for something else, although you could envision tuning the algorithm for providing more loans, say, to black applicants. But you also don't want to be providing loans to individuals who are not going to be able to pay off those loans, right, is my sense. And so we want to think about not just exactly the inputs and outputs of the decision-making system, but how that is being altered or undergirded by larger policy shifts at the same time. So I don't know if that looks like thinking about not just who's getting access to loans, but who's maybe getting help with lower interest rates or who's getting help with aid for those loans, but also then targeting not just the decision-making of which applicants are getting loans in the moment, but also how can we try to address those underlying wealth gaps, right? Like that's the real issue that we're dealing with here is not just the discriminatory decision-making process of who gets loans, but also this very large, very entrenched wealth gap. And so that if we're thinking about a more justice-oriented approach, we also want to be targeting that and trying to ameliorate those sorts of effects and the policies that continue to allow that wealth gap to continue, if not exacerbate it in the present.
Thank you. I think I was also interested in what you had to say with like the algorithmic versus heuristic thinking when the original HLSC people made those maps. So when you're thinking about a computational decision-making system versus like a human decision-making system, how is there a way that we can think about how we can adjust both to be more just, or are there ways that racist biases show up in both types of thinking? Is it better to have an algorithm? Is it worse? Is it?
Well, again, I think they're both bad, and I'd be interested to hear people's thoughts on this. But I was really struck by something Ben just said. If I could pivot to maybe incorporate this. So when you say adjust the algorithm, that's essentially what the federal government did in 1968 with the passage of the Fair Housing Act. And the Fair Housing Act had shortcomings, like it, for example, only applied to units of more than two unit properties, and it also didn't apply to properties where there was an owner-occupant. So it had its own flaws. But really what the government is doing is adjusting the algorithm to say, oh, now we're going to give more favorable loans to black people, not taking account of the fact that there's this long-standing history of structural inequality that's going to kind of set them up to fail. And there's a wonderful new book by Keeanga Yamada Taylor that you may be familiar with, Race for Profit, which talks about how the government sets up a new kind of market in which it still kind of guarantees that inner city landlords, developers, urban renewal agencies are going to take money out of these inner city neighborhoods. So just adjusting the algorithm and increasing black home ownership is not going to fix that problem. And here we see, black people are not being denied home ownership so much as they're being kind of concentrated in these areas where they've historically faced these kinds of negative housing conditions and life circumstances.
Should we give a moment for other of the online folks to jump in?
I can jump in with a very short comment. I think this is often, it's a political question, which is how do we want to address the disparities, the historical disparities that have been intentionally created in this country, right? And so to me, that has a lot to do with reparations. It has to do with, and so it's not an algorithmic question in my view, right? And so once we decide on that, then we can figure out, okay, what kind of, what to do with the math. But the problem is in this space, when we talk about fairness or algorithms, a lot of times people, it has to do, I think, with our education too, right? The way, people in data science or computer science, whatever, who are working on these algorithms are, thinking about what we call the view from nowhere, right? You're supposed to move away from this political question and pretend that everything is just math, then you can make it all fair. And so for me, that's the thing. It's a political question. And once we decide that political question, then we can figure out how to implement it. And in my view, I honestly have never really understood this conversation about a trade-off between accuracy and fairness, right? People say accuracy, fairness, trade-off. For whom, right? Fairness for whom? I think that all depends on how we set up the problem and how we decide what it means to work. What it means for an algorithm to quote unquote work. Who is it working for, and what does it mean for it to be fair? So that's sort of what I think in general. I think I was interviewed about something like this before, and so there's a movement where people are talking about algorithmic reparations. Maybe that's what they call it. But I think then when we move away from this question of what should the algorithm do, we ask ourselves what should society do. Then we can kind of reverse engineer that into our systems that we're currently working on.
Yeah, I'm nodding my head because I love those comments. And I actually think that it's really disorienting for me sometimes when I hear conversations where there's a lot of long-standing, multi-generational historical inequality, harm making, and then the question becomes, well, how do we formulate a policy to approve or not approve this loan? And I'm like, well, actually, it doesn't quite fit that way. You can't wedge the solution into loan approvals or risk assessments for mortgages. And so I think that the comment about reparation really rings for me. And then I also want to say that this idea of weighing wealth gaps when thinking about risk is a little bit deceptive in the sense that wealth gaps only matter when the terms are the same and have been the same. But when loans are unequal and have been unequal across many, many years, I think that the question of wealth gap is maybe a distraction to some degree. I find a lot of the discussion of risk assessment really opaque. What does it mean to talk about lending risk? And then also, why is it that the people who are being evaluated don't actually know what the terms are that they're being evaluated by? If you're a professor in a class, you would never teach a class this way and say, hope you get an A, but not going to tell you how you're being assessed. So this is kind of very similar to thinking about lending risk. And aren't there other ways of setting up the formula to assess risk more accurately? So for instance, placemaking and sense of community, there's been a lot of research showing that community drastically reduces risk of default or the desire to move out of a community. But as I understand it, lending risk doesn't actually account for communal kind of effects or community effects. And that's just one example. So it does seem to me that part of the problem is in the way that we're setting the terms and the transparency of the terms, and then accounting for the long arc that needs to happen when talking at all about fixing some of these problems.
Anybody would like to respond here, or good?
I've got some things kicking around in my head, but I don't know if it's worth bringing up. I mean, this all comes back to, investors making money, right? And they're wanting to set it up in such a way that they can be guaranteed a profit. And I guess I was thinking back to before we had the New Deal, the kinds of terms of financing were extremely onerous for lenders, and they were on a short-term basis. So I certainly wouldn't want to go back to an era where, you have to put down 60, 70% of the value of the house. You have to pay an interest rate of 8 to 10%. You have to take out 2 or 3 mortgages to cover the obligation. But the further you go back, you see lenders trying to kind of guarantee to the best that they can, a return. And they're merely kind of enacting their own pre-existing prejudices against people of color and taking advantage of the fact that people are politically, have varying levels of power, so they can't defend themselves politically in the same way. It's really striking because despite all the structural inequalities and disadvantages that black people face borrowing in the pre-New Deal and the New Deal Jim Crow housing market, a lot of commentators would say how remarkably good they were at paying their obligations. For one thing, they were more heavily policed, and they weren't able to default on their obligations as easily as white people could. But even with all the kinds of decks stacked against them, that people were able to take out loans and pay those off at least until the Great Depression hit and just destroyed the housing market, is remarkable. But even despite that, they came up with a system that completely enacted the existing prejudices of native-born white, upper and middle-class Americans, and put them in a position to extract value out of people who had lesser means and less political power. I don't know exactly where I'm going through with that, but I mean, it sounds rather familiar to what we're still dealing with today. No matter what kind of system you set up for, or whatever systems they've set up for this process, it seems like those are still kind of the operating assumptions. And maybe we need to rethink the whole kind of what we're trying to do with lending and homeownership, before we're in a position to do something constructive to make it more equal.
Is it okay if I jump in here?
Yeah, for sure.
I guess I would say, like, building on what you're saying, that part of what's happened is in the shift from a rental system, a majority rental system, to a majority owner system, is that some of those inequalities have become hidden or disguised. And so one of the stand-ins for inequality, the so-called improvement of inequality has been the rising homeownership rate. Well, see, you're still better off than when you're a renter, majority rental, or at least you're trending towards homeownership. But we know very well that that actually isn't an improvement, and it's a way of disguising some of the deeply unequal systems of lending that have appeared and are subterranean, and so you don't see it. And I do really agree that families across the racial sort of divides, many racial divides, have been historically incredibly responsive to loans and paying back loans, and also to paying rent, even in deeply unequal and openly unjust systems where slumlords are collecting rent. You see people still trying to make good on what they've agreed to do, which is to pay this rent. So I do think that people, by and large, are good faith actors, but that this shift that we're seeing happening is really a little bit of smoke and mirrors in terms of how we look at the longer arc of change.
Yeah, I guess my next question sort of a little bit builds off of that. So do you think that the problem of predicting lending risk, whether through human decision-making processes or computational algorithms, it inevitably enforces existing inequalities? Is this like the wrong question to ask, I guess? But like, I think if we're operating under this system, how can we design policies and tools that can intervene upon these existing inequalities?
I think that was kind of what I was driving at, and
Yeah.
You've said it much more succinctly than I did. But I think of Nathan Connolly, who in a recent blog post wrote, it's not just about ownership, it's about having political power to defend that ownership, right? If black people are entitled to, older housing in areas with lesser services and they have ownership, that's still not equality compared to what white people are getting in the suburbs, right? So, it's all about political power, as Timnit was saying, if we're going to change this equation and maybe change outcomes. It's not going to be enough just to adjust the formula about who's able to access homeownership per se.
Yeah, and I think in that sense, brings us back to this question of, I think in some ways, right, the algorithm can be a bit of a red herring in terms of that being the source of the problem. Certainly it is maybe making the system more opaque or bringing in different types of factors, but the system was rife with discrimination of similar sorts before, and I think the broader issue is, right, in terms of the structure of the types of decisions that are being made, the bases on which those decisions are being made, and the differences in power that exist in terms of what different groups have as resources coming in and what they have access to in terms of their home. So I think, if the structure of the decisions is, replacing the human with the algorithm raises new issues, but it's not that the human system before was better either. So the question shouldn't be about, just comparing the human system versus the algorithmic system, but what are the changes to the broader system that we need to make, and how can we push those forward? Because often in conversations about fairness, you do get into these very narrow debates about just saying, well, is the algorithmic system fairer or more accurate than the human system? And that's, typically that's an argument coming from people who are pushing for the algorithms and saying, well, isn't this better than the alternative? But the answer is not to say yes or no. The answer is to say both alternatives are bad and we need to find different ways out of this. And I don't study housing enough to know what those ways out of it are, but I think that that's sort of the general way that I think about these types of questions when you're dealing with algorithmic decision making in context of entrenched injustice.
Would anybody remotely like to jump in, or? Good?
Yeah, I was just thinking about Nancy's comment about what were you saying? It doesn't make the injustice apparent. It obscures it, kind of thing, right? And Ruha Benjamin says this a lot about algorithms. It's kind of a backdoor to racism. It makes it much easier to perpetuate it while feeling that you're not perpetuating it. And then could make it much harder to address because of that, right? And I do think that there are some new issues that come up with using algorithmic systems rather than people, because there are issues that come up with how people interpret the outputs of models rather than people, how scalable those are, the systematic biases, etc. That you might not see with people, even with horrible systems that are perpetuated by people. So I think that's one of my comments there. But I generally agree that a lot of times the questions again are societal, and it's not about how do we make these risk assessments fair. Well, a lot of people argue that risk assessments should not exist in the first place. A lot of these algorithms are used for punitive purposes, right? Risk assessments for instance, crime recidivism, so that you have to set bail, or for sentencing, just kind of for punitive purposes, right? And then if you talk to prison abolitionists, for instance, they have a whole framework for why these things should not exist, right? So a lot of times we can just sort of bypass all of that, societal conversation and zone in and hone in on how to design the algorithm, and that robs us of the imagination that we can have to create completely different systems in society. If we started from the understanding that everybody deserves a home, like, I think the conversation or the how we approach these things would be completely different. That it's a human right to have shelter. If we, you know what I mean? If we started from that point, I think the things that follow would be different, right? But sometimes I think there's assumptions that we already make in the underlying assumption that maybe the current system is fine. You know, we have loans and people need to repay them and stuff. I mean, it sounds normal. I mean, because we've done it for a long time. But maybe maybe everyone deserves shelter, and maybe what we should do is, I'm just saying stuff, right? Like that we should give everyone a home, and if they want to have a second one, then maybe they can go, apply for a loan, right? That seems to maybe transformative or something like that. But I think when we're stuck on just thinking about the algorithm, it robs us of this ability to think about what are different systems that we can be in. And I think, I do work in data science, AI, whatever you want to call it. But a lot of times, there are problems that I think I'm 100% sure this is a thing that perhaps I could work with technology on, and it's a good thing, or whatever. But there are many that are not clear to me, and that we're only in this place discussing those things because of, the way in which we approach how we think we should house people, for instance. So anyhow, that's my little mini rant about societal issues.
I like that also in the sense that you're talking about the limiting of our imagination and the funneling of it through this way. So that was great. And it does make me want to go back to Todd's point, which I thought was really great, which is that the assessment of risk is for profit, and for a profit of a very small subset of actors in this economy. And I think that's really important. So then what are the countervailing institutions and organizations that will represent the interests and the profit of the people who are not in that group, who are instrumentalizing this idea of risk? So anyway, just my 2 cents too.
And if I could salute your work as well, Nancy, I mean, these mortgages then get sold on the secondary market and get bought up by large investors. I think we all found that out in the 2008 crisis. But it's even generating a source of international capital. And Nancy's book talks about how US mortgage loans are funding housing and other development projects all over the world. That's how profitable this is. And I think that's why it's, people are so resistant to the idea of a complete rethink, and why we couldn't do something, so easily as what Timnit's suggesting, is because there's a lot of people's money riding on this. It's a huge driver of global economies, and so that's what we need to really be aware of and think about if we're going to think about changing this, in a dramatic way.
Yeah, I'm really curious. What are some, forces that can push back against these institutions that, you mentioned earlier? So you could really talk about that.
What are the forces pushing back against?
Yeah, I think Nancy mentioned, pushing back against the whole structure of profit making, the community structures, I guess.
Well, I would defer to Nancy to talk about, that if you would choose to. But I mean, for me, it's about a mentality. These same ideas about race and property values are with us, folks. I mean, especially among white Americans, there's still this kind of underlying assumption that people of color moving into white neighborhoods is somehow going to negatively affect, values, even if they're, profess to be completely comfortable socializing with black people. There's still so this kind of legacy that we're talking about here historically, that was once supported by the federal government and then proliferated through private industry until it was officially banned. Those mentalities are still with us to this day, and that's a huge thing that I think we're up against if we're going to start to change this. But I mean, there are also very real-world actors who stand to profit from the system as it has existed, who are going to push back against any attempt to, start from the premise of housing as a human right, or to think about reparations. That's one reason why I'm so determined to get the historical facts straight, because if we're ever going to make a legal case for reparations, we want it to be airtight. So we want to understand how the maps were used, who got loans and who didn't get loans. Even if black people did get loans through the Hulk, for example, it was still a way of reinforcing segregation. If they got refinancing loans, they stayed in the same neighborhoods where they already lived. And also, my colleague Dale Winley and I have talked about Hulk as a way of paying back white investors who held most of the exploitative mortgages on these black-owned properties. So if you flip it and you look at it that way, it suddenly doesn't look like such a kind of generous program to support homeowners. It did save them and keep them in their homes, but it also put the money back in the pockets of those lenders and was an attempt to kind of reboot the housing sector. And it seems to be there's always that kind of underlying, there's always the concerns of investors coming first in these questions. No matter how fair you try to make it for people to be able to access loans, that's kind of what it's at the root of the system, and which I think Timnit's asking us to really kind of think a little harder about.
These are really great comments. And just backtracking for, sorry, I'm still thinking about what you said, Todd. But backtracking for a second, just to rattle off some of the ways in which people have been trying to push back, so we can just throw these into the mix. I'll just kind of rattle off a bunch. Obviously, fair housing litigation, although all of the things I'm going to say have problems and have issues embedded in them. I'm not saying these are the golden ticket out of here. So fair housing litigation, vacancy taxes, subsidies in the form of public housing and other forms of public subsidy, community benefit agreements, participatory budgeting, community land trusts, just cause eviction movement in California that's happening right now, the Housing First movement. So those are just some of the ways.
Did we want the audience to have some questions?
Do we have a whole pile of questions. Do we have time for, are we moving to? Do you want to ask another one of yours, or do we want to switch to the audience questions? How much time do we have, I guess? We have 18 minutes. Okay. Yeah, I think maybe we'll go to the audience questions and then come back to our last final question. Sounds good, yeah.
Okay. So by the way, for those of you who would like to upvote questions, again, the QR codes are around so you can see what the questions are. Okay, so
there's a mic in the back if you want to grab a mic or a podium.
Thank you. Okay, great. I will also hand it off to anyone in the audience who would like to ask a question. But let me kick it off with one of the questions that that's come through. So the question is, if political power is a key part of correcting the historical injustices, what role can data, algorithms, and AI play in increasing the political power of groups that are harmed by racist policies?
So, yeah, I think that's a great question and a really important one in this type of conversation around AI and justice, because, you know, I think the starting point, the short answer is working with communities to help them build power, because that requires a real shift for computer scientists and data scientists who, you know, there's sort of we see, okay, well, here's this decision-making process. This decision-making process clearly has some problems going on. It seems biased, and people are concerned about discrimination. So let me try to target the decision-making process and develop an algorithm that targets that. And that is really the MO of data scientists thinking about policy generally, or the application of algorithms in decision-making in many different contexts, right? How can we use the algorithm to improve a specific decision? And if we step back and think about the question more broadly in terms of justice and substantive equality and reparations, the answer is that the entire role of the data scientist has to shift from being sort of the key actor putting in place the central object of reform towards supporting other communities and other movements that are pushing for the more structural reforms that are necessary. So that to me is really the shift of, it's not here's the algorithm to develop, but here are the broader types of processes that you need to use to reorient your research, much as Timnit was saying earlier. And then from that will hopefully flow different roles and different ways of building community power and pushing the agenda towards these larger structural changes.
Other comments from the panel? I have more questions too.
I think we can get to more questions.
Great. Oh, let me take one from the audience as well.
So thank you. So I'm an attorney who works with homeowners who often are in foreclosure. So I'm looking at when everything goes bad. So my question really has to do with if you're thinking about the process of someone going through the algorithm and then tweaking the algorithm so that they have a better chance of getting a mortgage, getting a home, become a homeowner, getting access to this wealth which is passed down through generations. The real question is what happens when they get the mortgage? And that what I see is that people who have access to wealth are able to fare so much better because when things go bad, and a lot of people have drops in income right now, the pandemic. 2008, there was a huge crisis. People had lost value in their homes. They couldn't refinance. They lost their homes. So the question is, how do you push through people from the algorithm into a system that really is a setup for failure? Because people who have access to wealth, they fare the storm better. And people who are often black don't have access to the wealth and they don't fare very well and they kind of fall through the cracks.
I think it speaks to the issue of, long-standing structural inequality due to past discrimination more than anything else. I think we could do things like reforms. I'm from Cleveland, Ohio, and the city of Cleveland was trying to sue mortgage companies for subprime issuing, the abuses associated with subprime mortgages. Now that didn't go anywhere. For one thing, the Republican-led Ohio State legislature slapped that down and said they had no standing to do that. But I mean, I think that we need to really reforms like that, but also maybe go beyond too. I don't think, in the same way that just tweaking the algorithm is not going to fix it, I think reforming the existing system necessarily isn't going to lead to the outcome that we so urgently need.
Great. Oh, I'm going to give you one more from the audience and then come back to the virtual questions.
Hi. So I have a question thinking about, so we're talking, there's been a lot of themes in this panel, which I think are really interesting. And one of them is about, you're talking about fairness sort of versus equity, or even how we define fairness to begin with. And my question is, how do you all as academics, designers, policymakers, et cetera, deal with the fact that really structurally in this country right now, we don't actually have wide agreement or even an agreement at all that fairness or equity are things that we should be thinking about. So we can design what you're talking about, and what we're all talking about is sort of breaking the system in the sense, or designing a completely new system where we are taking into account in some way or another historic racial discrimination and the legacies of that today. And how can we pragmatically do that when right now we're arguing about whether we can teach slavery in schools, for example, right? So just, I know that's a really big question, but what ideas do you all have on that front?
I can try this. It's quite bleak. I'm not gonna lie. It's just like, I got fired for just writing a paper. So it's it's something that's super frustrating for me because I always feel like I can't implement my imagination. We were talking about imaginations. Even in my research, it's very difficult to do that because there are so many harms that are perpetuated. And then I feel like, okay, we have to undo those first, but then you try to undo them and you'll be persecuted, right? And so it's a big fight. But I think that I'm seeing a lot of grassroots organizations that are very effective. So Mi Gente is one of them. I mean, sorry, I don't know very much as much about the housing space specifically. So maybe Nancy or Todd or like you guys can cover that. But I'm just in general, the whole racist sentiments, anti-immigrant sentiments, white supremacy, etc. I mean, there's a number of groups that are fighting back, and also even in tech, right? So, for instance, Mi Gente has mapped out all of the large tech organizations, companies that are involved in the persecution of immigrants, right? And so that other members of the community are aware. I've just read their report recently. And so they've been very good at mobilizing people. And there's a number of other organizations like that creating grassroots support. But we have to be extremely vigilant. I'm actually very worried about like the rise of fascism, authoritarianism, and all the way in which it's what's happening in the U.S. We can't even treat history, teach history, because again, to me, that is a continuation of how privilege perpetuates itself. You want to pretend that you are not like standing on the marginalization of so many generations of people before you, and the privileged being privileged, having such a privileged background, right? You don't want to think about that. You want to pretend you want to think we're not starting from there. So you just don't want to teach history. You don't want to And I think that's a very that's just a defining feature of privilege and power and how they're perpetuated. So I think we have to be very vigilant. We have to organize. We have to vote. I mean, really, when people are very kind of disillusioned and they're like, oh, they're all the same, etc. And I think personally speaking, I'm not into that. We have to be part of, we have to call our local representatives. We have to pay attention. So that's what I think. And also the grassroots organizing. That's really important too. And so that's how I'm approaching it in my work. Well, in my work, I created a new institute. So my idea was that I can't do the work I want to do in academia or in industry. So I tried to create a smaller independent research institute that allows me to do the kind of work that I'm interested in.
That's great. Timnit, that was both bleak and inspiring. So thanks for that. I'm gonna take one more question from the audience, and then I'll hand back Aurora to do the final question. And I'll also say that there are a lot of really great questions that have been submitted. So I think Catherine and I will find a way to sort of share these to keep the conversation going. So the last one I'm gonna pick is one that's been upvoted, which is I think a question about how people who have not been trained as data scientists can engage with data scientists or engage in data. And I think this was directed at Nancy, since you confessed to not being a data scientist in your introduction. So the question is, but I think I'm opening up to anybody who wants to comment. Nancy, how do you research or report on impacts of gentrification as an urban historian and root it in data without being a data scientist? You are using some data, e.g. census, but maybe not algorithmic. So I think the question is for someone who does not have a background, who doesn't come from a data trajectory, how do you fold data into your work?
I think you're not going to like my answer, which is not as well as I should. And I think that part of the slides, so the contribution that I think qualitative research makes is in shaping the kinds of questions we ask and in listening very closely to people who I guess might be called subjects, but aren't really subjects. They're the people who hold the knowledge. And so we go to them to try to figure out what the right questions are and how to pivot and to think about issues like gentrification. So if, for instance, if we're looking at gentrification, we might think of it as community replacement, but if you talk to some of the people who are actually being pushed out of communities, they might talk about it as strategies for retaining intergenerational wealth, for instance. So the questions change and you have to pivot as you think about qualitative research. And I'm not as good, frankly, at measuring how incomes change or how sort of profit is made over time and spatially. This actually, Todd is a historian that should answer this question, not me, because he does do that kind of work. But I will say that these kinds of interdisciplinary conversations are so important for all of us to learn from each other, because none of us can do all of the research all the time.
I'm someone else who's struggling to incorporate data into my work. And in our own profession as historians, quantitative history has been kind of its own field ever since the 1970s. So in a digital environment, I think there's more opportunities to start reintegrating and have these kinds of conversations that are so valuable. And I think of my colleague, Ladale Windling, whose website, Mapping Inequality, has influenced a lot of work, and the shapefiles have been used by a lot of social scientists for some of the research coming out on long-term effects of redlining. So I think we can learn more from each other, and going forward, I think these kinds of conversations are the best kinds of ones that we can have.
Maybe just to add sort of from the other side of that, I think really to plus one on what Nancy was saying about the importance of other types of work for asking the right questions. In my research, I think about a lot about how the training of data science and computer science actually prevents those individuals from engaging in social contexts appropriately, that their training prevents them from asking the right questions and considering the full social and political context. And so, as we think about interdisciplinary collaboration, as much as we're asking the historians, how do you work with data if you're not trained as a data scientist, we should also be asking data scientists, how do you engage with urban policy if you're not engaged as someone who knows urban policy or urban history or housing policy, right? The question should really be symmetrical, because the lack of knowledge is often equal and goes in both ways. And there's a tendency to assume that if you have the data knowledge, then you're good. And certainly data scientists are often trained to assume that, but the onus should also be on them to really deeply understand the context in which they're engaging.
That's a great lead into our final question. Well, so our final question was originally about how, so for the historians and for the data scientists, what are some difficulties in addressing the methodological gap between different social sciences and computational sciences, and what kind of dialogue and collaboration is helpful? So that was, I think, addressed really greatly. So if you want to continue speaking on that, I also kind of wanted to ask you guys, because I think you had some questions for each other that were really great at the beginning. So in the spirit of cross-disciplinary conversation, if you wanted to ask each other any questions. So you could speak to either of those, yeah.
Aurora, actually, I just discovered the question list online, so my bad for not looking at this
Oh, yeah,
earlier.
no worries, yeah.
But can we actually talk about one of the comments, which is, I feel like the speakers are circling around a critique of racial capitalism without naming it. I love that comment. And I'll just say briefly, the reason why I don't name it is because I think subconsciously, I want to talk about it without having people immediately kind of block themselves to the ideas. Sometimes we use certain phrases that make people who are listening, and this sometimes can be in a classroom setting for me, I try not to use certain words that trigger a response that rejects the ideas, and that's why I don't use some of these terms, but absolutely this comment is correct, that that's what I think we're talking about too.
Some of us teach in states where we're actually forbidden from broaching certain concepts even in a college classroom. So maybe that affects why we might be more reticent. I mean, certainly that's what we're talking about, but call it racial capitalism. I think, which comes from Cedric Robertson, obviously. I mean, it's capitalism, right? If you look at the history of capitalism, it's always leveraged these kinds of differences in power and exploited people of color disproportionately. So I hope that that's become clear through what we've talked about today, even if we haven't explicitly made reference to that construct and theory. And thank you for bringing that up as well.
I I think it is true. We a lot of our critiques, because we were talking about specifically in the U.S., were about racial capitalism. But personally speaking, I also, there's also like authoritarian governments that I've seen that I grew up in that I escaped, and so I never limit my critique for it to be about capitalism only. And I think sometimes if people haven't lived in another context, it's hard to see how there might be a shift in, it's not just that the context that we know in the U.S. And that we can center and that and even the European context, but there are other contexts by which you can still have a lot of corruption and generational issues that are can be related to capitalism, but also not. So I just want to say that. So in my work, so for instance, we're doing this work on social media harms. There's a genocide in Tigray right now, and a civil war in Ethiopia, and so I try to broaden the scope when I'm thinking about these things. But yeah, 100% racial capitalism is one of the biggest issues that we can't even name it because it's illegal. I mean, I can't even believe it. That's the state of affairs, and that's why I was saying it's quite bleak.
All right. Any last thoughts from anybody? I think we might want to start wrapping things up.
Sounds good.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for your time.
Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you.
We now have a 15-minute break for you to have conversations and chat with the panelists, and we'll resume in 15 minutes.